So today we have Clare Backhouse again with us for the second time. And I have to say that the first time you came, Clare, it was so informative, and there were a lot of people who got some really good, deep, insightful knowledge from what you said. So Clare Backhouse is a registered nutritionist who is specializing in the area of thyroid health. And a lot of the stuff that she speaks on, teaches her clients, comes from a place of deep knowledge and strong research. So Clare, welcome. And today we're going to talk about your special interest, which is thyroid health and all the things that surround it. So
Johnson, thank you for having me back.
No, you're welcome. So Clare, just as we start off, can you just tell me how you came upon this area and why you're interested in it?
Yeah. I became interested in thyroid health really by necessity, because I myself developed what was diagnosed as Hashimoto's thyroiditis, which is a particular thyroid condition. And the experiences I had, both in mainstream medicine and in complementary medicine, made me realize that supporting thyroid health was a sort of an underserved area, and it made me really excited to support other people in their journey with thyroid health. Yeah.
Right. And in terms of the study bit of it, what was that like to come to this point?
Yes. And actually, before I forget, I must say I've got a rather spectacular cough at the moment, so I may be muting myself from time to time in this recording, and if I suddenly go quiet, that will be why. I'll be having a little cough. Yes, so the study that I did, mainly in my training at the Institute of Optimum Nutrition, but I've also been very influenced by the work of Karazian, who has done a lot of work on the autoimmune component of underactive thyroid issues. Yeah. Right.
So could you just run us through what is thyroid health about, or what is thyroid disease about, if you wish? And how does that present to people?
Yeah. I think if you imagine the thyroid as a bit like an orchestra conductor keeping everyone in time, or perhaps a metronome that you would keep in time to, the thyroid gland, in a sort of basic way of describing it, kind of keeps the body on time and together, and it sets the pace of various functions in the body, pretty much everything. So if your thyroid was under functioning, you might notice that your bowel movement slowed down, or you feel colder, or you feel more tired. So everything slows down a bit. And if you have a hyperactive thyroid, you would notice yourself feeling a bit on edge, a bit sort of too energetic, becoming like losing weight without meaning to, that sort of thing. Whereas a thyroid that works well, everything is working, everything's in unison, and you're going at the correct pace with enough energy. But the key way that we work out how well your thyroid is functioning is through blood tests.
Okay, and is that a simple procedure? Is it how is that done?
Well, do you know, blood tests for thyroid function are both really simple and a source of controversy. If you went to your GP and asked for your thyroid to be checked, they would test for 2 hormonal markers for your thyroid, which is great, but unfortunately, those markers don't pick up the full picture of what's going on with your thyroid health. And unfortunately, those markers don't often give, because they're hormone only markers, they don't necessarily check for causes of thyroid problems. And a high percentage of the causes of thyroid problems are autoimmune. So when you have a thyroid blood test that is hormone only, as opposed to hormones plus antibodies, you can sometimes miss a thyroid problem that's coming down the pipes, if that makes sense.
Okay, so it's there's a need to check, from what you're saying, the antibodies.
Yes, and the other thing, so I can give you a sort of more exact description. So a GP will test for TSH, which is called thyroid stimulating hormone, which is the hormone that your body uses. Your pituitary gland uses this hormone to kind of, it's, to put it in a funny way, to request your thyroid gland to produce thyroid hormone. So it's like please produce some thyroid hormone. So that's TSH, and you want that TSH to be at a nice sort of moderate level. You don't want that to be raised. So you don't want your pituitary gland to be screaming at your thyroid gland to get on with it. You want your thyroid gland to be doing such a good job that the TSH is just gently pumping out at a really sensible level. So in lab terms, that's kind of 1.5 or 2, ideally. But the other typical hormone result that's looked at by the GP would be thyroxine, which is also T4. And that's the sort of base thyroid hormone. So that's the hormone that we want to come out at sufficient levels so that your pituitary doesn't have to scream at your thyroid gland. But the snag is there's one other hormone that's not so regularly checked by GPs, and that's T3, which is triiodothyronine. And that's the active form of the thyroid hormone. So you have the TSH telling the thyroid gland to produce thyroxine or T4, and then that needs to convert to the active form T3 to be any use to your body. But the awful thing is that if you don't check for T3, you could be having the TSH and T4 doing their stuff, but the active, most useful form of thyroid could be doing all sorts of dodgy things, but you don't know. Right. So it's possible to have a perfect set of thyroid results at the doctor with TSH and T4, but you could have T3 not working well for various reasons. You could have autoimmune antibodies boding badly for the future, but not be able to deal with it. So in a way, yes, it's easy to get your thyroid results checked, but it's quite challenging, I have found, to get those antibodies and the T3 checked as well. So quite often I will send my clients to a private test to get those done.
Is that a cost issue in terms of having it done within the public health system?
I suppose you would have to ask somebody within the public health system for details. My sense with regard to autoimmunity is that because there isn't within the public health system a designated protocol for what to do if you do find these autoimmune antibodies, there's a sense in which, like, why would we check for that? Because there's nothing we could do if we did find them. Whereas from my perspective, there are several things that can be done if you find those autoimmune antibodies. And so it's absolutely, to the point to find them. Right. So I think it's all dependent on what you're trained to respond to. So because I'm trained to respond to, I'm trained to think about the causes of autoimmunity, mm-hmm. and seeing if we can reduce autoimmunity by getting at the core triggers of it. That's why I'm really interested in it. But I can fully understand that from a public health perspective, if you don't have a protocol for autoimmunity, you just don't want to test for it.
Okay, so in your line of work then, Claire, let's say you've tested my blood and we've come up with some numbers that suggest that there's some autoimmunity issues going on in my body. What would you do with that next?
Yes, a very good question. It would depend on all the other things that I've discovered about you, first of all. So when I work with somebody, I always send them a very large questionnaire beforehand, which I read before we meet. So it will absolutely vary from person to person. However, some of the typical themes would be looking at when you began to experience symptoms. So we know that there are various triggers for autoimmunity. Sometimes they're environmental. You've had an exposure to something like mold or heavy metals or a certain virus particularly. Some autoimmunity has been, there's some research to show that reactivation of the Epstein-Barr virus can trigger autoimmunity. Now, Epstein-Barr virus is very, very common. Most people have had it, but in some people, reactivation can trigger autoimmunity. In some people, severe gut problems can trigger autoimmunity, or intolerances that have been gone for a long time unattended. Liver troubles can trigger it. It will vary, and there is a genetic component. It's not, there are certain genetic predispositions that are known to make it more likely that you could get autoimmunity, but that doesn't mean that you would have to have it. There would have to be a number of other factors lining up to set that off.
Okay.
So, but it would be, and there are other things. So there are certain foods that will trigger worse autoimmune reactions and an increased attack against the thyroid. So the most famous one is gluten, that the body often mistakes for the thyroid gland, just to put it sort of very basically. And so by eating gluten, you're encouraging your body to increase its attack on the thyroid gland. Whereas by avoiding gluten, you can quite often reduce the body's attack on its own thyroid gland. So for some people who are sort of on the slippery slope towards an underactive thyroid with just the antibodies showing, but the hormone results fine, sometimes something as simple as going gluten-free can halt that progress. But it's different for everybody. Yeah.
Right. So you're not saying that if I turn up and have my antibodies tested and I have no symptoms, you're going to say, well, maybe you should stop eating gluten.
There's a high possibility I might, if you have the antibodies, even if you don't have symptoms. But actually, it depends. If you had, most people will have a few. So if you take a test, most people will have a few, but they'll just be within range. They'll be within the sort of typical reference range, which seems to be useful. But the interesting thing is that some people will have symptoms with just a few antibodies that are only just over the reference range, and other people will have will only have symptoms when they're much, much higher. So your lab results are unique to you, so you can't really compare, oh, this person had 300 on their TPO antibodies and this person had 45, but they might have different readings but the same intensity of symptoms. So it all depends on your unique immune system.
So that raises, I can understand when you say in terms of, to use the phrase mainstream medicine, it's like, okay, so what do I do with this figure? Because I think one of the things that's certainly lacking within my medical training way back when was I had no idea of anything to do with nutrition and the influences on health.
Yeah.
So it's good to see that what you do seems to complement but not contradict mainstream medical practice.
You've put your finger on something. I really hope that my practice, for myself, I hope that my practice will always act in that sort of complementary way, because it's a shame when people either reject nutrition or reject mainstream medicine, because both work together so well. I mean, I myself reaped the horrible benefit of, actually, how to put this, I reap the consequences of trying to avoid my GP when my thyroid was in the process of being attacked, and I was in that very slow process of diagnosis. So even though I'm sad that currently the diagnosis process in mainstream medicine for underactive thyroid is very, very slow, it's even sadder when people with an underactive thyroid avoid their GP and don't get replacement hormone. I think there's a phrase that gets used, and I know it's used because people repeat to me what their GPs tell them. And they get told by their GP, I'm afraid this is going to mean that you have to be on medicine for the rest of your life. And so this is for people whose thyroids have got to the stage where they need to replace thyroxine. They need to take it synthetically. But of course, when they hear the word medication, they think, oh no, I can't bear that thought. There's got to be another way. And so they come to me hoping that I'm going to tell them they don't have to take thyroxine. Unfortunately, I won't say that to them because it's not a medication, it's a replacement. Right. It's a hormone replacement. And you can't, trying to live without thyroxine is like trying to run a car on empty. It's just quite dangerous. And the other thing is thyroxine itself, even though it's a basic hormone that gets converted, from what I gather, it itself is anti-inflammatory, which is why a lot of people feel quite a lot better immediately when they take levothyroxine, the synthetic version of T4, because it is naturally anti-inflammatory. But unfortunately, because the snag is that people will go to their GP, get their thyroxine, but when they don't also work on the autoimmune side, sometimes they can find an initial improvement with the levothyroxine and then symptoms return. And that can either be because of poor conversion from thyroxine into the active T3, or it may be to do with ongoing autoimmunity, where that inflammation and that attack is just interfering with thyroid function and causing all sorts of other issues as well.
And so it's the autoimmune side of the equation is related to your lifestyle, the things you do that, or your nutrition that causes more inflammation or makes the problem worse, basically.
Yeah, I think there are so many different triggers for different people. So for some people, just having an extremely sugary diet will be increasing inflammation generally, and therefore making it the whole picture harder for them. So it might not be literally triggering autoimmunity, but it's increasing the overall picture of inflammation in their body. But then there are specific foods like gluten, and then foods that the body can sometimes mistake for gluten, like corn or egg or soy. And it's unique to everyone. Not everyone will have the same thing. So that's called cross-reactivity, when the body, it's really not doing well with gluten, but it kind of accidentally misdiagnoses the other foods that it's encountering. And then, so sometimes people with autoimmune conditions are helped by reducing certain things in their diet. But this itself is a subject of controversy, because you've got diets like the autoimmune paleo diet, which reduces all sorts of things that are considered potentially inflammatory, like nightshade vegetables such as tomatoes or potatoes, like eggs, dairy, gluten, anything with sugar, that sort of thing. And some people find that is an absolute game changer. They are able to live a normal life. They go into remission. It's perfect. Other people find that they are, because they're not eating grains and they're not eating beans on that kind of diet, it affects their microbiome, because that fiber feeds the microbiome and keeps it really diverse. They can find that actually their health doesn't improve. So again, it's for everyone. Working to reduce that, the potency of that autoimmunity is so specific to them. Yeah. So sometimes it's trial and error.
Yes, that's what I was going to say. It sounds like it's experimental as you go along to find the right fit for you in terms of how you eat and what you eat.
I find this. I am not personally a massive advocate for the very expensive kind of intolerance tests and allergy tests. I think some people really find them useful. I have found that, well, in my opinion, that the best way to discover how you respond to a food is to remove it for a while and then reintroduce it in a very careful manner. So with observation, because nothing's going to tell you how well your body responds to something than you testing it, because intolerances change over time. So it's possible to have an intolerance test 1 year, but 2 years later have different intolerances. So an allergy would be a very sudden IgE reaction, whereas an intolerance is when your gut is not dealing with a food well, and your gut changes from time to time, depending on what you're eating, depending on how stressed you are, depending on how well you're sleeping, all sorts of factors. So I think I find it more helpful simply to do things by trial and error, which sounds a bit inaccurate, but I actually find it more potent for the clients.
So would these clients have to do you recommend that they keep food journals or journals of certain activities or events that may cause stress? How do they keep track of where they are and what's going on?
Yeah, food journals can be really useful, and they are a challenge to keep, funnily enough. But I do recommend that when people are doing any kind of elimination or reintroduction, that they keep a journal, and especially that they just note what they ate and then what their mood was. Although I will say that very often, if it's a marked intolerance, they almost don't need to keep a journal because it's so obvious. So, but yeah, it is a really important thing. Sometimes people like to take photographs of their food, and it's just an easier way of logging what they did. Yeah. But I try to keep it. Some people can get quite overwhelmed keeping food journals, and other people love it. So I try to make it doable for the client in question.
Yeah. Does anybody use apps as ways of journaling?
Yeah, there's lots of different apps. Yeah, I find, funnily enough, I don't find myself relying on any one particular app. I suppose possibly the reason I'm not always asking people to get an app is because I'm so much hoping that they will find a new normal that feels intuitive. Right. And I think so. I mean, if somebody really seems like they could do with using an app, of course I'll recommend it. But I'm always hoping that my clients will find a new normal where they can instinctively choose what's going to help them wherever they are, whether they're at a restaurant, whether they're with friends, whether they're at home, and that it won't be this kind of stressful, gosh, must check my phone type situation. I'm really looking for something that just feels so full of kind of just feels sociable and joyful, basically. And so my tendency, some people just adore putting information into apps and working off that, and that's fabulous. But unless they're that kind of person, I'm trying to keep the joie de vivre in there.
Right. No, I understand that from when I go on my slow runs. So I have a fitness tracker.
Okay.
And I do use it because it tells me how slow I'm running.
Yeah.
But from time to time, I think, okay, well, I'm not actually going to look at this device because I'd like to be in tune with my body or where it hurts, more to the point, or what's hurting, or what if I if I twist my foot this way, or if I stretch my, extend the length of a stride, whatever it is that self-experimenting, but getting
Yes.
feedback from your body.
Yes.
And I think that's how I see it from a different perspective, from a running perspective.
Almost like that you're more present.
Yes, you're more present to who you are physically. And I think my own way of thinking is that's hugely beneficial to all of us.
Yeah.
Because there is such thing as the gut-brain axis, which tells you what's going on. But most of the times we live in a world where I actually don't know what's going on inside because I'm kind of too busy watching TV while I eat.
Yes. And the other thing is this lovely thing which everyone's been talking about lately, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which is produced when we have fun. And so I suppose keeping things fun is crucial for the whole gut-brain axis.
Yes, exactly. So when it's fun, then your stress levels go down, your stress hormones go down. And I'm sure that has a part to play in thyroid health as well. Yes,
it really does. And actually, particularly for people with Graves' disease, I've mentioned Hashimoto's, which is the autoimmune underactive thyroid, but it's possible to have an autoimmune overactive thyroid. And I had one client who got a new pet and was so stressed about this new pet that her antibodies went through the roof, and she started getting hyperactive symptoms again, having been kind of much quieter and not needing to have anything more than a very low dose of the medication that's usually used, which is carbimazole. But yes, she suddenly sort of had a massive intensification of her Graves' disease, and it was purely stress induced. We were able to help her with various other things to support kind of calming down. But another factor was simply getting used to her new pet and reducing stress. Stress, particularly for Graves, but for both any kind of autoimmune disease, stress will be a really important factor, partly because when you're very stressed, your body sends less blood to your digestive system because it's getting you ready to rush about and deal with stressful things. And then when there's less blood going to your digestive system and it's working less well, then your gut is in less good shape. And when we remember that our immune system, as in autoimmunity, our immune system is 70% at least in our gut, we sort of realize, this is all connected. Stress has a genuine link with a thyroid health and gut health. And any thyroid issue will almost always have at least some need for gut support, unsurprisingly. Do
you find with the clients that you help that there's spillovers into other areas of their life? So I guess people come looking for help with thyroid issues, but they would see, for want of a better way of saying it, positive side effects.
Yes. It's just, I suppose, with anything that's got such a lot of symptoms, and I mostly deal with people with underactive thyroids, but when your bowel movements are more regular and normal, as we all know, that affects how well you function in all sorts of ways, mood, but also that impacts your hormone balance. Because if you're, particularly for women, if you haven't got regular bowel movements, you may be getting estrogen dominant, because estrogen is excreted out of your bowel. And if you've got stool just sitting in your bowel, not going anywhere, then old estrogen. I can never decide if it's estrogen or estrogen because I have clients on both sides of the Atlantic. But yes, estrogen can sit in your bowel and then get reabsorbed back in to your body, so that you have too much estrogen circulating and it's not leaving successfully. So just a moment, I'm going to cough.
Okay.
Sorry about that. So yeah, there are lots of different things that can happen. So partly people find themselves sleeping better.
Yep.
And often mood is a big thing that improves, because one of the things that happens if your whole body is slowing down because the thyroid hormone that's conducting your body is slowing down, that can cause symptoms that feel like depression. So often mood improves.
And I guess, is it the opposite if you've got a hyperactive thyroid, that you're more irritable and you might have greater problems with your relationships with people?
You know, it's absolutely possible. I think if you're feeling sluggish and kind of can hardly get out of bed, then everything is harder. And I remember this very clearly. I once had, before I was diagnosed, but I was in the middle of, at the beginning stages of Hashimoto's, I just couldn't get out of bed. And I thought to myself, what's wrong with my willpower? Why am I so lazy? I even had a friend who offered to ring me up, to wake me up, make sure that I got out of bed in time. But I just wasn't doing at all well. And everything felt like such an uphill battle. And I think when you feel that life is an uphill battle, sometimes you can find yourself doing all the things you have to do, but then social life, you cut out social life because that's the thing you can't quite manage. And so that's a very typical thing to happen in the early stages of an underactive thyroid, that you kind of pretend to yourself that everything's fine and you're just being a bit lazy in the mornings, but actually you aren't able to do everything that you used to be able to do, and it does affect your relationships. Yeah.
Wow. So it's amazing that the amount of interactivity or connectivity that it feels like from just talking about the thyroid issues that it's like proper detective work. It's working out this step by step and untangling it one step at a time.
Yeah, it does often feel like that, because for some people their thyroid results are okay, but they've got really good levels of T4 but not very good levels of T3, and so you're thinking, what's the problem with conversion? Why isn't the body converting this? Is it a gut problem? Because that's a key site of conversion from T4 to T3. Could it be a liver problem? That's another site. Could it be a genetic problem? There's an enzyme called DIO2, there's DIO1 and DIO2, which are important for converting from T4 into T3. And some people genetically just aren't very good at that conversion. And so they can't be put on ordinary, they do much less well on ordinary synthetic levothyroxine. They actually need to take either just synthetic T3 or some other preparation that involves T4 and T3 together, because they just can't, it's no good giving them just T4 because they won't convert it successfully. So yeah, there is definitely a sort of, you find yourself going through the layers, and and if you aren't getting breakthrough, you just have to go down to the next layer. But thankfully there are very to put it another way, there are sort of very obvious foundational things that you can always begin with and then build on that.
Right. Okay. So if the gut seems to be a core piece of what's going on in the whole situation. So you're saying to me that one possible thing is that T4 to T3 conversion is not happening because of gut issues.
Yeah.
Can you just drill down a little bit more on that for me? What does that mean for me as a layperson? What does that actually look like, or how is that happening?
So if you've got quite a lot of inflammation happening in your gut because you're not breaking down your proteins very well, the breakdown of food in there isn't happening successfully. The inflammation in your gut means that the conversion doesn't happen well. So that could be a result of having had lots of antibiotics. It could be the result of if you are lactose intolerant, for example, but you keep having milk products. It could be, so some people will have they'll have a perfect diet, but they will be living in a moldy house, and the toxins from the mold, I think I mentioned this before, the toxins from the mold can then impact your gut and cause inflammation there. And if your microbiome, the bacteria and fungi living in your gut, if they aren't balanced in a really healthy way, that can predispose you to inflammation as well. So it's possible to have less beneficial bacteria overgrowing and therefore encouraging inflammation in a way that, or encouraging, for example, degradation of the mucus layer of the gut. And that, again, you want a really healthy gut lining so that food particles they aren't in any danger of kind of going through that very thin gut lining into the body.
Right. So again, one of the key core foundational pieces is the microbiome and how we look after it or abuse it, for want of a better way of saying.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And the good news is that, a bit like how it's possible to help heal a wound on the skin that you see, it is possible to heal your gut and to look after it. It's not impossible to do that, and it doesn't have to be expensive either, which is the good news. Yeah.
In terms of gut healing, in your experience, what sort of time period? So let's say we were chatting and you say, well, Johnson, your gut microbiome looks not in the best form. And you make some suggestions, and I take your advice and I change aspects of my diet. What's typical time frame would I need to go through before I see any benefits from it? Or is there such a thing?
Oh, yeah. Do you know, I don't have a rule of thumb. I do notice that there's a sort of 4-day sort of window whereby if you experiment with a food, usually you need to wait up to 4 days to see if it affects you.
Okay.
So by the same token, changes to your gut, you might experience them literally after 3 or 4 days. But it does vary from person to person. It depends on how trashed your gut is to begin with. But I am very surprised at the number of clients who say to me, after taking out this food, or after taking probiotics sometimes, or certain quite small changes, they will notice something within the week. They feel better within the week. Now, that might sound very slow to some people because they're used to the drug paradigm of take a drug and see a change that night. But the nutrition paradigm, it just is gentler. It takes a little bit more time. But as you mentioned before, you often see side benefits to it, which is lovely. Yeah.
Where do you stand in terms of the plant-based versus omnivore type diets? What's your take on that, Claire?
Do you mean generally or with regard to thyroid?
Well, in terms of thyroid health, let's say stick with that.
Yeah. So I think it's a really interesting one. It depends on the reasons for someone going plant-based or not going plant-based. So first of all, to say, if someone's a committed vegan for ethical reasons, then I just work with them as is. But if someone isn't pre-committed one way or another, I usually recommend that people have, I suppose in a funny way, I'm going to say a mixture of both, very high plant content and some animal protein. So, and people's tolerance or response to animal protein is very different. There are some people that just find that they really do much better on a pretty much vegetarian diet, not vegan, but others, they kind of wilt if they aren't eating some meat every day. Now, I'm a massive, massive advocate of animal foods that are properly farmed, not farmed in a way that ruins the earth. And I think it is possible to farm animals in such a way that benefits the earth. So just to put that in there, I'm not one of these people that thinks, oh yes, eat tons of meat and who cares where it comes from. I think it really matters where it comes from and how it's farmed, because it can either benefit the planet or not. So in that sense, there are some plant-based people and some meat eaters who've got very, very almost identical commitments to the earth, but they're coming at it from different perspectives. But yeah, high plant content is great, especially when it's diverse. And many people will have come across Tim Spector's work on the diversity of plants in your diet correlating with the diversity of beneficial bacteria, which of course, if beneficial bacteria all do slightly different things, so you've got more benefits going on in your gut, coming from your gut, if you have a more diverse plant. So I'm not strict with people. If they really are committed not to have meat, I don't pressure them to have meat. If they include meat already, I will encourage them to have it in moderate quantities. But the key for me is much more protein, whether that's animal or non-animal based, and including at least 3 or 4 vegetables with every meal. Well, lunch and supper particularly. So I'm always saying to people, look for like a palm-sized amount of protein, roughly. And this is in my kind of life, rather than going around measuring things. Look for a palm-sized amount of protein, roughly, and then 3 or 4 different vegetables at lunch, 3 or 4 different vegetables again at supper, if you can.
Great.
So that variety should encourage your gut microbiome, and then the protein supporting your energy levels.
Fantastic. Claire, as ever, it's been wonderful talking to you.
It's really lovely to talk with you. Thank you for having me.
And I'm sure that there are many people who would benefit from hearing what you've said, who will take on board what you said. And just to say, just as we end, where do people find you?
Oh, thank you. So on Instagram, I am at Transformation Nutrition UK, and otherwise my website is www.transformationnutrition.org, and there's a contact form on my website. So if anyone wants to drop me a line, it should be easy.
Excellent. Great. Claire, it's been wonderful, and no doubt we will see and meet each other in reality one day.
That would be lovely.
Okay.
Thanks, Johnson.
All right. Bye for now, Claire.